The GPS died exactly 3 miles before Gearbrook Falls, as if modern technology itself rejected that place forgotten by time. Mackenzie Torres drove her Honda Civic through the winding roads of New Hampshire, following only the handwritten directions the lawyer had scribbled on the back of a yellowed envelope. "Follow the road until you hear the sound," read the last line, an instruction she had considered too poetic for a legal document. But now, with the windows down and the autumn air flowing into the car, she understood. It was a constant, rhythmic sound, like the mechanical heartbeat of some slumbering giant. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. It didn't come from any specific direction. It seemed to emerge from the earth itself, from the trees, from the thick air that smelled of machine oil and rose petals. The first sight of Gearbrook Falls made Mackenzie hit the brakes involuntarily. The town spread across the valley like a meticulously crafted Victorian diorama, with its wooden houses painted in pastel tones, clock towers dotting the horizon, and geometrically perfect gardens. But there was something disturbingly artificial about the scene. Every person she could see moved with the same precise cadence, like wound figures in a giant music box. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound grew louder as she descended the main hill. It wasn't just one clock. It was dozens, hundreds of them, all synchronized in a temporal symphony that made her bones vibrate in harmony. Mackenzie had worked with timing systems in her career as a software engineer, but she had never experienced anything so visceral. She parked in front of the general store, watching through the windshield as she tried to process what she was seeing. 2 women conversed on the sidewalk, their gestures moving in exact 2-second intervals. A man swept the entrance to his shop, each movement of the broom perfectly timed. 3 children played in the nearby park, but even their laughter seemed to follow a predetermined rhythmic pattern. This is bizarre, she thought, but at least it's organized. Organization was something Mackenzie had completely lost in the last 6 months. Since David died in the refinery explosion, her life had become a chaos of insurance forms, empty condolences, and sleepless nights spent debugging code as a desperate way to keep her mind occupied. The unexpected inheritance of her grandfather's house, a man she barely remembered meeting, had emerged as an opportunity for escape. Maybe a little predictable order was exactly what she needed. The general store door chimed with a perfectly tuned bell when Mackenzie entered. The interior looked straight out of 1890, with dark wooden shelves, hand-labeled glass jars, and a scent of cinnamon and machine oil that made her think of ancient workshops and homemade cookies. "You must be Horatio's granddaughter," said a female voice, soft but laden with unquestionable certainty. Mackenzie turned to find a middle-aged woman behind the counter, her graying hair pulled into a bun so perfect it seemed sculpted. She wore a navy blue dress with white lace on the sleeves, and her eyes, an almost artificial green, studied her with uncomfortable intensity. "Yes, I'm Mackenzie Torres, and you are?" "Cordelia Ashworth, proprietor of this establishment for 17 years, 4 months, and 6 days. The precision of the response made Mackenzie blink. "We were expecting your arrival. The council calculated you would arrive today at 3:47 p.m., based on traffic patterns and the average efficiency of Honda Civic vehicles, model year 2019. Mackenzie automatically checked the watch on her wrist. 3:46 p.m. "How did you—" "Your grandfather was a very precise man," Cordelia continued, as if she hadn't been interrupted. "He taught us that punctuality isn't just a virtue, it's a necessity. You've inherited more than just the house, dear. You've inherited a responsibility." The woman's tone carried a weight that made Mackenzie's stomach contract. "What kind of responsibility?" Cordelia smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a mother would give a child who had just asked a question whose answer she wasn't ready to understand yet. "All in due time, dear. For now you need to settle in. The house is prepared for your arrival. Mrs. Pemberton has kept everything in perfect order. Dinner will be served at exactly 6:30 p.m. in the community hall. Don't be late." It wasn't an invitation. It was an instruction. Mackenzie took the directions to the house, written in impeccable handwriting, and left the store with a growing feeling that she had entered a world that operated by completely different rules. The constant tick-tock seemed louder now, as if the town itself was timing her steps. Gear's house sat on the highest part of town, a Gothic Victorian mansion that dominated the valley like a dark castle. 3 stories of dark wood, octagonal towers, and an impressive collection of windows that looked like eyes observing every movement in the city below. The garden was a masterpiece of geometry, every shrub pruned into perfect shapes, every flower planted in precise mathematical patterns. But it was the house itself that made Mackenzie stop at the entrance of the stone pathway. It was breathing. Not literally, but there was a rhythm in the structure, an almost imperceptible expansion and contraction that followed the ambient tick-tock. The windows seemed to blink in sequence, curtains moving slightly as if pulled by internal breezes. And from somewhere in the depths of the building came a low, constant hum, like the purr of a massive engine running in perfect efficiency. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting at the front door, a woman so elderly she seemed to have been carved from the same dark wood as the house itself. Her silver hair was braided with mechanical precision, and she wore a black dress that wouldn't have looked out of place in a daguerreotype from the 1850s. "Miss Torres," she said, her voice carrying the same measured cadence as everyone else in town. "Welcome to your inheritance. I trust your journey was precisely as calculated?" "It was punctual," Mackenzie replied, unsure why she felt compelled to match the woman's formal tone. Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Punctuality is the foundation upon which all other virtues are built. Your grandfather understood this better than most." She stepped aside, gesturing for Mackenzie to enter. "The house has been maintained in exactly the condition Horatio left it. Every mechanism cleaned and calibrated, every clock synchronized to the master timepiece in the tower room." The interior of Gear's house was a maze of dark wood paneling, brass fixtures, and an overwhelming collection of timepieces. Grandfather clocks lined the hallways like sentinels, their pendulums swinging in perfect unison. Smaller clocks adorned every surface: mantel clocks, wall clocks, desk clocks, even tiny pocket watches displayed in glass cases. But it was the sound that truly overwhelmed. The collective tick-tock was so loud inside the house that Mackenzie could feel it in her chest, synchronizing with her heartbeat, until she couldn't tell where the mechanical rhythm ended and her own pulse began. "The master bedroom is prepared for your occupancy," Mrs. Pemberton continued, leading her up a staircase that creaked in rhythm with their footsteps. "Meals are taken in the community hall with the other residents. Evening duties begin at precisely 10 p.m. You'll receive your assignment after dinner." "Assignment?" Mackenzie stopped on the stairs. "I'm sorry, but what exactly do you mean by duties?" Mrs. Pemberton turned, her pale eyes reflecting the amber light from the brass wall sconces. "My dear, surely you understand that inheritance comes with obligation. Your grandfather didn't simply leave you a house. He left you a role in the grand mechanism. Every gear has its purpose, every spring its tension, every pendulum its arc. The question isn't whether you'll take your place in the design. It's whether you'll do so willingly or be forced into position by necessity." A chill ran down Mackenzie's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "And if I choose not to participate in whatever this is?" The old woman's smile was as mechanical as everything else in the house. "Oh, my dear, that hasn't been an option for anyone in Gearbrook Falls for over 70 years. The mechanism requires all its parts to function properly. Without every component in perfect synchronization," she gestured vaguely at the walls around them, where the tick-tock seemed to grow momentarily louder, more insistent. "Well, let's just say that chaos is not something our community tolerates." Mackenzie was led to the master bedroom, a cavernous space dominated by a 4-poster bed that looked like it could house royalty. The walls were covered with technical drawings, mathematical equations, and what appeared to be blueprints for impossibly complex machinery. But it was the massive window that drew her attention. From here, she could see the entire town spread out below, and for the first time, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The people weren't just moving in rhythm, they were moving in patterns. Specific, predetermined paths that created geometric shapes when viewed from above. A man would walk from the bakery to the fountain, where he'd meet 2 women who had approached from opposite directions. They'd converse for exactly 30 seconds, then separate along precise angles that would take them to new intersection points with other residents. It was like watching a living blueprint, human beings functioning as components in some vast, invisible machine. Beautiful, isn't it? Mrs. Pemberton had appeared beside her at the window, silent as smoke. 73 years of perfect synchronization. No crime, no conflict, no chaos. Every person knowing their exact purpose and fulfilling it without question. Your grandfather's greatest achievement. "This isn't normal," Mackenzie whispered, pressing her hand against the cool glass. People don't live like this. They can't live like this. Can't they? Mrs. Pemberton's reflection smiled in the window glass. What you see as restriction, we experience as freedom. Freedom from uncertainty, from the anxiety of choice, from the terror of meaninglessness. Every moment of every day has purpose here. Every action contributes to the greater mechanism. Mackenzie turned away from the window, suddenly desperate to escape the precise perfection below. I need some air. I'll walk around town before dinner. Of course, dear. But remember, dinner is at exactly 6:30 p.m. The community hall is located at the intersection of Gear Street and Clockwork Avenue, the building with the large bronze timepiece above the entrance. Don't be late. Mrs. Pemberton glided out of the room with mechanical precision, leaving Mackenzie alone with the tick-tock and her growing sense that she had walked into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple inheritance. She spent the next 2 hours exploring Gearbrook Falls, and with each passing minute, her unease deepened. The town was undeniably beautiful, every building perfectly maintained, every street spotlessly clean, every garden a masterpiece of horticultural precision. But the residents were something else entirely. They smiled when she greeted them, responded politely to her questions, but there was something hollow in their interactions. Like actors who had performed the same play so many times they had forgotten they were acting. Their movements never varied from the predetermined pattern she had observed from the window. Their conversations followed scripted rhythms. Even their laughter came at precisely measured intervals. And underneath it all, that constant tick-tock, growing louder as the sun began to set. At exactly 6:30 p.m., Mackenzie stood before the community hall, a grand building that looked like a cross between a town hall and a cathedral. The bronze timepiece above the entrance showed the time with mechanical precision, its hands moving in perfectly synchronized sweeps. She could hear voices from inside, a low murmur of conversation that somehow managed to sound both human and mechanical at the same time. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The hall was filled with perhaps 200 people, all seated at long wooden tables that had been arranged in geometric patterns across the floor. Every seat was occupied except one, a chair at the head table that faced the rest of the gathering. As soon as she entered, every conversation stopped simultaneously. Every head turned toward her in perfect unison. The silence was absolute except for the omnipresent tick-tock. "Miss Torres," came a voice from the head table. A tall man with silver hair and eyes like polished brass stood and gestured to the empty chair. "We've been waiting. Please, take your grandfather's place." Mackenzie hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where could she go? Her car was parked at the house. The nearest real town was miles away, and something about the collective gaze of 200 synchronized people made her legs feel like lead. She walked to the chair and sat down. The moment she was seated, every person in the hall stood simultaneously and began to applaud. Not enthusiastic applause, measured, precise applause that lasted exactly 30 seconds before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. "Citizens of Gearbrook Falls," the silver-haired man announced, his voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect hall. "Tonight, we welcome the final component of our grandfather mechanism. Miss Mackenzie Torres, granddaughter of our founder Horatio Gears, has returned home to claim her position as primary engineer." Primary engineer? Mackenzie started to stand, but the man's hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, kept her seated. "I think there's been some mistake," she began, but he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "For 73 years, 4 months, and 16 days, our community has functioned in perfect harmony with the grand design. Every citizen has fulfilled their role with precision and dedication, but the mechanism has been operating at reduced capacity since Horatio's passing. Tonight, that changes." He gestured to the crowd, and suddenly every person was reaching into their pockets, their purses, their jackets. In unison, they withdrew identical brass keys, small, intricate devices that gleamed in the amber light of the hall's chandeliers. "The keys to the mechanism," the man continued, "held in trust by every citizen until the primary engineer's return. Miss Torres, the question is simple. Will you accept your inheritance willingly, or must we activate the compliance protocols?" Mackenzie's mouth went dry. "Compliance protocols?" The man smiled, but it was the same mechanical smile she had seen on every face in town. The mechanism cannot function with missing components, Miss Torres. One way or another, you will take your place in the grand design. The only choice you have is whether you do so as a willing participant or as a calibrated part. Around the hall, the citizens were now holding their keys aloft, and Mackenzie could see that each key was connected to a thin brass chain that disappeared beneath their clothing. They weren't just holding the keys were attached to them, physically, permanently. "You see," the man said, his voice growing softer and more hypnotic, "your grandfather understood that humans are inherently chaotic creatures. Left to their own devices, they create conflict, suffering, waste. But with proper calibration, proper timing, proper engineering," he gestured to the perfect synchronization around them, "they can become something beautiful, something useful, something eternal." The tick-tock was growing louder, more insistent. Mackenzie realized it wasn't coming from the clocks. It was coming from the people, from their heartbeats, artificially synchronized by whatever those brass keys were connected to. "What did you do to them?" she whispered. "We perfected them," he replied simply. "And now, Miss Torres, it's time to perfect you." He produced a brass key from his vest pocket, larger than the others, more intricate, with gears that seemed to move on their own even as she watched. "The master key, your inheritance, your destiny." Mackenzie shot to her feet, the chair clattering behind her. "You're all insane. This is imprisonment, not perfection. I won't." But even as she spoke, she could feel something changing in her chest. Her heartbeat was beginning to synchronize with the collective tick-tock. The rhythm was seductive, calming, like a mechanical lullaby that promised to ease all anxiety, all uncertainty, all choice. "No." She pressed her hands to her chest, fighting against the growing synchronization. "I won't become one of them. The house," she gasped, suddenly understanding. "It's not just the keys. The house is part of it. The breathing, the humming. It's conditioning me." The man nodded approvingly. "Very good. Yes, the Gears house is the heart of the mechanism. Every moment you spend within its walls, every breath you take of its perfectly calibrated air, brings you closer to complete integration. You can feel it already, can't you? The peace of perfect timing, the relief of predetermined purpose. And she could. God help her, she could. The tick-tock rhythm was washing over her like warm water, promising an end to all the chaos and pain of the last 6 months. No more grief. No more uncertainty. No more desperate late nights wondering what the point of anything was without David. Just perfect, predictable, meaningful order. Her hand began to reach for the master key. No. The voice came from somewhere deep inside her, from the part that had spent years debugging impossible problems, refusing to give up until she found the solution. The engineer in her, the problem solver, the woman who had built systems instead of merely using them. If this was a mechanism, then it could be understood. And if it could be understood, it could be repaired or dismantled. She pulled her hand back and looked directly into the man's brass-colored eyes. "I need to see the blueprints first." A murmur ran through the crowd, the first unscripted sound she had heard all day. The man's smile faltered for just a moment. "The blueprints?" "I'm an engineer," Mackenzie said, her voice growing stronger as her professional instincts overcame her fear. "I don't implement systems I don't understand. If you want me to be your primary engineer, then I need to understand exactly what I'm engineering. Full documentation, complete schematics. I want to see how this mechanism really works before I agree to maintain it." The tick-tock seemed to skip a beat. Throughout the hall, citizens began to look at each other with the first hint of individual expression she had seen. Uncertainty, confusion. The man recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "Of course, Miss Torres. All documentation is available in your grandfather's laboratory, perhaps after the integration ceremony." "No," Mackenzie interrupted, taking a step back from the head table. "I review the documentation first, tonight, before I make any decisions about keys or ceremonies or integration. That's how proper engineering works, understanding before implementation." She was backing toward the door now, and she could see panic beginning to spread through the crowd. Their perfect synchronization was starting to break down. Some citizens were rising from their seats, others remaining seated. The unified tick-tock was becoming ragged, uneven. "Miss Torres," the man called, his voice losing its hypnotic quality and becoming sharp, desperate. "The mechanism requires..." But Mackenzie was already through the doors and running into the night. Behind her, she could hear the sound of 200 chairs scraping against wooden floors as the entire population of Gearbrook Falls rose to follow her. She ran through streets that were no longer perfectly orderly, past gardens where flowers seemed to be wilting in real time, toward the Gears house that loomed against the starlit sky like a mechanical mountain. Whatever spell of synchronization had held the town together was breaking down, and she could feel the weight of that breakdown pressing against her back like a physical force. The house was waiting for her, its windows blazing with warm light, its walls pulsing with that seductive breathing rhythm. But now she understood what she was seeing. Not a home, a trap. A perfectly engineered cage designed to transform her into the final component of her grandfather's impossible machine. She burst through the front door and ran straight for the stairs, ignoring Mrs. Pemberton's calls from the kitchen. The laboratory had to be in the basement. That's where engineers always put their workshops. And in that laboratory would be the answers she needed. The blueprints, the schematics, the detailed documentation of exactly how Horatio Gears had turned an entire town into a clockwork prison. And, if she was lucky, the instructions for how to shut it all down. The tick-tock of the house seemed to grow faster, more frantic, as she descended toward the basement. As if the mechanism itself knew that its primary engineer had just become its primary threat. The basement door was locked, with a mechanism unlike anything Mackenzie had ever seen. Instead of a traditional keyhole, the lock consisted of a series of interlocking brass gears that rotated in complex patterns when she touched them. The surface was warm, almost alive, and she could feel vibrations running through the metal that matched the house's breathing rhythm. Above her, the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Mrs. Pemberton's voice drifted down the stairs, no longer the measured cadence of perfect civility, but something sharper, more urgent. "Miss Torres, please return to the main floor. The laboratory is not yet prepared for your inspection." Not prepared. That meant there was something down there they didn't want her to see. Something that would explain why an entire town had willingly transformed themselves into components of a human machine. Mackenzie studied the gear mechanism, her engineer's mind automatically analyzing the patterns. 7 primary gears, each with a different number of teeth, rotating at different speeds. But there was something familiar about the ratios, something that tugged at her memory, the Fibonacci sequence. Each gear represented a number in the mathematical progression, and they were rotating at speeds that maintained the golden ratio. Her grandfather hadn't just been an inventor. He'd been a mathematician of extraordinary skill. She pressed the gears in sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. The mechanism clicked softly, and the door swung open on silent hinges. The smell hit her first, a mixture of ozone, brass polish, and something organic that she couldn't quite identify. The basement stretched out before her like a cathedral dedicated to the art of precision engineering. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools that seemed to blend clockwork with medical instruments. Blueprints hung from the ceiling on rotating displays, their technical drawings so detailed they looked like anatomical charts. And in the center of it all stood a device that made Mackenzie's breath catch in her throat. It was a heart. Not metaphorically, literally. A mechanical heart the size of a small automobile, constructed from brass and steel and materials she couldn't identify. Its chambers pumped with perfect rhythm, circulating not blood, but some kind of luminescent fluid through transparent tubes that disappeared into the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself. The tick-tock that permeated the entire town wasn't coming from clocks. It was coming from this massive cardiac engine, pumping life through Gearbrook Falls like blood through arteries. Magnificent, isn't it? Mackenzie spun around to find Mrs. Pemberton standing at the bottom of the stairs, but the elderly woman had changed. Her skin had taken on a metallic sheen, and when she moved, Mackenzie could see the subtle gleam of brass mechanisms beneath the surface, not hidden prosthetics, integrated systems that had replaced her original anatomy. "How long?" Mackenzie whispered. "How long have I been more machine than human?" Mrs. Pemberton stepped closer, and Mackenzie could hear the soft whir of gears with each movement. 47 years, 2 months, 8 days. I was among the first volunteers for your grandfather's perfection process. The integration was challenging initially, but now I cannot imagine existence without the clarity it provides. The footsteps upstairs had multiplied. The entire town was in the house now, moving with that same mechanical precision, even as their synchronization continued to deteriorate. Mackenzie could hear them spreading through the rooms above, searching for her with methodical efficiency. "What did he do to you all?" Mrs. Pemberton gestured toward the walls, where Mackenzie now noticed dozens of framed photographs. They showed the transformation of Gearbrook Falls over the decades, but not the transformation of buildings or streets, the transformation of people. Early photographs showed normal families, children playing, couples embracing with genuine warmth. But as the timeline progressed, the people in the images became more and more uniform. Their expressions grew identical, their postures synchronized, their smiles mechanical. "Your grandfather understood that human suffering stems from chaos," Mrs. Pemberton explained, her voice taking on the reverent tone of someone reciting religious doctrine. "Unpredictable emotions, irrational decisions, the terrible burden of individual choice. He offered us something better, purpose without confusion, community without conflict, existence without anxiety." Mackenzie moved deeper into the laboratory, studying the blueprints that covered every surface. They weren't just mechanical drawings, they were surgical procedures. Detailed instructions for implanting brass mechanisms into human bodies, for replacing organs with clockwork alternatives, for synchronizing nervous systems with external timing devices. The keys, she realized, her voice barely a whisper. They're not just symbolic, they're actual keys to the mechanisms inside people's bodies. The cardiac regulators, yes, Mrs. Pemberton confirmed. Each citizen carries a precisely calibrated device that synchronizes their biological rhythms with the master heart. She gestured toward the massive mechanical organ in the center of the room. No more irregular heartbeats, no more hormonal fluctuations, no more biochemical mood disorders. Pure, perfect, predictable function. Mackenzie found herself staring at a blueprint labeled Primary Engineer Integration Protocol. The drawing showed a human figure with the chest cavity opened, revealing a complex array of devices that would essentially replace the entire cardiovascular and nervous systems. At the center was a device labeled Master Control Interface, a mechanical system that would link the primary engineer's consciousness directly to the town's central mechanism. She wouldn't just be maintaining the machine, she would be the machine. "This is slavery," she said, her voice growing stronger with anger. "You've turned yourselves into remote-controlled puppets. We've transcended the limitations of biological existence," Mrs. Pemberton countered. But for the first time, there was something uncertain in her voice. "We no longer suffer from depression, anxiety, loneliness, or fear. We are part of something greater than ourselves. What about love? What about joy? What about the things that make life worth living?" Mrs. Pemberton's mechanical smile faltered. Those emotions were impractical. They led to inefficiency, to conflicts of priority. The mechanism requires unity of purpose. Mackenzie continued exploring the laboratory, her heart racing as she uncovered more and more evidence of her grandfather's horrific vision. Technical manuals described the process of emotional calibration, the systematic removal of human feelings that couldn't be quantified and controlled. Surgery logs detailed the gradual replacement of organic components with mechanical ones. And buried in a locked drawer that she managed to open with a small screwdriver, she found the most damning evidence of all: a journal, written in her grandfather's hand, documenting the early days of the experiment. Subject 23 shows remarkable adaptation to the cardiac regulator. Pulse now maintains perfect 60 BPM, regardless of external stimuli. However, patient reports decreased capacity for emotional response. Consider this a feature, not a flaw. Emotional volatility has always been humanity's greatest weakness. The children adapt faster than adults. Their brains are more plastic, more willing to accept the new neural pathways. I estimate complete integration for subjects under 12 can be achieved in as little as 6 months. Margaret resisted the procedure initially, claiming she would rather die than lose her humanity. After integration, she thanked me for freeing her from the chaos of unregulated emotion. The fear, the doubt, the suffering, all gone. She is genuinely happier now, though happiness may not be the correct term for the state of contentment the mechanism provides. Page after page of clinical observations that treated human beings like malfunctioning machines to be repaired. But it was the final entry that made Mackenzie's blood run cold. The town is nearly complete, but the mechanism requires a primary engineer to function at full capacity, someone with the technical knowledge to maintain and expand the system, but also someone with the genetic compatibility to interface directly with the master heart. My granddaughter shows promise in both areas. I have begun preliminary conditioning through the house itself, atmospheric adjustments to make her more receptive to integration. By the time she arrives, she should be ready for the procedure. Preliminary conditioning. The breathing house, the hypnotic rhythms, the growing sense of calm she had felt, despite the horror of what she was discovering. Her grandfather had been preparing her for this moment since the day she inherited the property. You found the journal. Mackenzie looked up to see Mrs. Pemberton reading over her shoulder, her mechanical eyes scanning the pages with perfect focus. He was brilliant, the woman continued. Visionary. But he made one crucial error in his calculations. Just one? Mackenzie's voice dripped with sarcasm. He assumed that the primary engineer would choose integration willingly, once presented with the logical benefits of the system. He didn't account for the possibility that his successor might prioritize emotional attachment over rational improvement. The footsteps upstairs had stopped. The house had grown silent except for the tick-tock of the master heart and the soft whir of Mrs. Pemberton's internal mechanisms. But it wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of preparation. They're waiting for me to come back upstairs, Mackenzie realized. The integration can be performed with or without consent, Mrs. Pemberton confirmed. Consent simply makes the process less traumatic, but the mechanism will have its primary engineer, Miss Torres. Your grandfather's design is too perfect to be abandoned now. Mackenzie looked around the laboratory with new eyes, searching for something she had missed. There had to be a way out, some weakness in the system, some oversight in her grandfather's meticulous planning. She was an engineer too, and she knew that every complex system had failure points. That's when she noticed the power sources. The master heart wasn't self-sustaining. It was connected to a series of generators hidden behind panels in the laboratory walls. And those generators were connected to the people, she whispered. The mechanisms inside the townspeople aren't just controlling them. They're powering the system. Human beings as batteries. Mrs. Pemberton's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her mechanical eyes. Biological energy is remarkably efficient when properly harnessed. Each citizen contributes approximately 100 watts of power through their integrated systems. With 200 active units, the town generates sufficient energy to maintain the master heart indefinitely, until the people die. The mechanisms significantly extend human lifespan by regulating all biological functions at optimal levels. Current projections suggest each citizen will remain functional for approximately 150 years before requiring replacement. They weren't people anymore. They were components with expiration dates. Mackenzie moved toward the master heart, studying its construction with professional interest. It was an incredible piece of engineering, she had to admit. The precision was flawless, the efficiency remarkable. But like all complex systems, it had dependencies, points of critical failure. What happens if it stops? She asked. It cannot stop, Mrs. Pemberton replied immediately. The system has multiple redundancies, backup power sources, emergency protocols. But what would happen if it did stop? Hypothetically, Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, and in that hesitation, Mackenzie saw the answer. The mechanical woman's conditioning was too perfect, too absolute. She literally couldn't conceive of the system failing because that possibility had been programmed out of her consciousness, which meant she couldn't defend against it. Mackenzie pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, shining it directly into Mrs. Pemberton's optical sensors. The sudden, intense light caused the woman to freeze, her system struggling to adapt to the unexpected input. In that moment of mechanical confusion, Mackenzie ran, not toward the stairs. That way lay the waiting crowd of synchronized citizens. Instead, she headed for the power controls hidden behind the wall panels. If she could disrupt the energy flow to the master heart, even temporarily, it might create enough chaos to give her a chance to escape. Miss Torres, please stop, Mrs. Pemberton called, her voice distorting as her vocal system struggled to compensate for the sensory overload. You don't understand the consequences. Without the mechanism, the citizens will... But Mackenzie wasn't listening. She had found the main power coupling, a massive brass switch that controlled the flow of energy from the human generators to the master heart. Her hand closed around the lever. What will they do? She asked, turning back to face Mrs. Pemberton. Die or live? Mrs. Pemberton's mechanical features contorted with something that might have been fear. They will remember, she whispered. All of it. 70 years of memories, emotions, experiences that were suppressed by the mechanism. The grief, the loss, the pain of everything they gave up. It will return all at once. And many will not survive the psychological trauma. Those who do, they will never forgive us for what we allowed ourselves to become. Mackenzie's hand tightened on the power switch. Around her, the master heart continued its perfect rhythm, pumping mechanical life through the arteries of Gearbrook Falls. Upstairs, 200 people waited in synchronized silence, their humanity locked away behind brass keys and clockwork hearts. She thought of David, of the grief that had driven her to this place, of the pain of loss and the burden of choice, and all the messy, chaotic, beautiful elements of human existence that her grandfather had tried to engineer away. Then she thought of the children in those photographs, their natural joy gradually replaced by mechanical contentment, of generations who had never known what it felt like to fall in love, to create something new, to make a mistake and learn from it. Sometimes, she said, pain is the price of being human, and she pulled the lever. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The master heart stuttered, its perfect rhythm faltering as power levels dropped throughout the system. Emergency lights began flashing, and alarms that hadn't sounded in decades began wailing through the house. But it was the sound from upstairs that made Mackenzie's chest tighten with fear and hope in equal measure. Screaming. Not the mechanical distress signals of malfunctioning automatons, but raw, human screaming as 200 people suddenly remembered what they had lost. Mrs. Pemberton collapsed, her mechanical systems shutting down as the power that sustained her artificial components failed. But as she fell, something extraordinary happened. Her brass-tinted skin began to return to normal human coloration, and when she looked up at Mackenzie, her eyes were no longer mechanical perfection. They were human eyes, filled with confusion and dawning horror. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice now carrying genuine emotion for the first time. "What have we all done?" The master heart gave one final, shuddering beat and fell silent. For the first time in 73 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Gearbrook Falls was running on chaos instead of clockwork. And upstairs, 200 people were discovering whether they still remembered how to be human. The silence that followed the master heart's death was perhaps the most terrifying sound Mackenzie had ever experienced. For several seconds, the entire house held its breath. No tick-tock, no mechanical humming, no whisper of synchronized movement from above. Just the absolute quiet of a machine that had finally, after decades of perfect operation, simply stopped. Then the screaming began. It started as a single voice, high, keening, filled with a grief so profound it seemed to shake the foundations of the house. Within moments, it was joined by another, then another, until the sound became a chorus of human anguish that poured through the floorboards like a flood. These weren't the controlled, measured expressions of the synchronized citizens. These were the raw, primal sounds of people discovering that they had lost everything they ever were. Mrs. Pemberton, Margaret, Mackenzie reminded herself, the woman had a real name, was curled on the laboratory floor, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from 7 decades of suppressed emotion. The brass mechanisms beneath her skin were dark and lifeless now, no longer integrated with her nervous system, but simply dead weight embedded in her flesh. "The children!" Margaret gasped between sobs. "Oh God, the children! I had children! 3 beautiful children, and I let them. We let them." Her voice broke entirely, as the full weight of recovered memory crashed over her. Mackenzie knelt beside the woman, her engineering instincts warring with her human compassion. She needed to get out of the house, to escape before the townspeople recovered enough to come looking for answers. But she couldn't abandon Margaret to face the psychological devastation alone. "Tell me about them," Mackenzie said softly, helping Margaret sit up against one of the workbenches. "Your children." "Lucy was 7 when we came to Gearbrook Falls," Margaret whispered, her eyes staring at something only she could see. She loved butterflies, collected them in a jar with holes punched in the lid. She would spend hours watching them flutter around, naming each one. And Tommy was 5, such a serious little boy, always asking why about everything. And baby Sarah, her voice cracked. Sarah was only 2. She still called me Mama instead of Mother. The weight of it hit Mackenzie like a physical blow. How old would they be now? Lucy would be 80, Tommy 78. Sarah, Margaret's mechanical precision was still there, but now it was being used to calculate decades of stolen time. 75 years old, if they're still alive. If the mechanism kept them alive. Above them, the chaos was intensifying. Mackenzie could hear heavy footsteps, furniture being overturned, voices raised in confusion and anger. But underneath it all was a sound that made her skin crawl. The gentle weeping of elderly people discovering that they had been children when their humanity was taken away. "We have to get out of here," Mackenzie said, though she wasn't sure where they could go. The basement door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying across the laboratory. 3 figures stumbled down the stairs. 2 men and a woman, all elderly, all wearing the brass keys that now hung uselessly around their necks like memorial tokens. But their eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been since Mackenzie arrived in Gearbrook Falls. "You," the woman said, pointing at Mackenzie with a shaking finger. "You did this. You broke the mechanism." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Mackenzie stood slowly, positioning herself between Margaret and the newcomers. "Yes," she said simply. "I did." "Do you have any idea what you've done?" one of the men demanded. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but now it was layered with something else. Raw, uncontrolled grief. 70 years, gone. 70 years of memories, experiences, life itself, locked away behind that goddamned machine. "I was 23 when they put the key in my chest. 23. I had a wife, plans, dreams." He gestured helplessly at his aged body. "Now I'm 93, and I don't even remember her face." "But you're alive," Mackenzie said. "You're human again." "Human?" The woman laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "I've just discovered that I've spent the last 7 decades as a remote-controlled puppet. That I watched my own son grow up, age, and die while I felt nothing more than mild programmed affection. That I attended his funeral with the same emotional engagement I brought to sweeping the streets. How is that human?" Margaret struggled to her feet, using the workbench for support. "Because now you can grieve for him," she said softly. "Now you can feel the loss. Honor his memory. Carry the love you had for him even if you can't remember expressing it. The mechanism took our capacity for pain, but it also took our capacity for meaning." "Easy words from the woman who helped design our prison," the second man spat. He was younger than the others, perhaps only in his 60s, which meant he had been just a child when the transformation occurred. "You were my teacher, Mrs. Pemberton. You told us the integration would make us better, stronger, happier. You watched us line up like lambs for slaughter." "I was already integrated by then," Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength as she faced the accusations. "By the time you children went through the process, I was no longer capable of questioning the system. I genuinely believed it was for your benefit because that's what I had been programmed to believe." The laboratory had become a courtroom, with Mackenzie and Margaret as the defendants and 3 people representing 70 years of stolen humanity as the accusers. But before the confrontation could escalate further, new sounds filtered down from above, shouting, running footsteps, and something else that made Mackenzie's blood run cold. Breaking glass. Lots of it. "What's happening up there?" she asked. "Chaos," the woman replied grimly. "People discovering that their entire lives have been lies. Some are handling it better than others. Some," she shuddered, "some are handling it very badly indeed." One of the men moved to the stairwell and called up to someone above. "Status report. 3 confirmed suicides," came the reply, shouted down from what sounded like the main floor. Dr. Reynolds threw himself from his tower window. The Morrison twins walked into the river. "Mrs. Chen is trying to remove her cardiac regulator with a kitchen knife. We've got her restrained, but she's fighting like hell." Margaret made a sound of pure anguish. "This is what I was afraid of. The psychological trauma of sudden reintegration, combined with the physical reality of 70 years of lost time. Many won't be able to handle it." "How many?" Mackenzie asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We don't know," the woman admitted. But the mechanism suppressed more than just emotions. It also suppressed the survival instinct when it conflicted with efficiency. A lot of people haven't had to deal with genuine despair in decades. They've forgotten how to cope with overwhelming feelings. The sound of more breaking glass came from above, followed by shouting that was growing increasingly frantic. Mackenzie realized that by stopping the mechanism, she hadn't just freed the people of Gearbrook Falls, she had unleashed 7 decades of suppressed trauma all at once, with no preparation, No gradual adjustment, no support systems in place. She had quite possibly killed them all. "There has to be something we can do," she said, looking around the laboratory with desperate eyes. "Some way to ease the transition, to help them process what's happening." "The mechanism was designed to be permanent," Margaret said quietly. "Your grandfather never intended for it to be reversed. The neural pathways that govern normal emotional response were surgically severed and replaced with mechanical alternatives. When the power stopped," she gestured to the dark brass devices visible beneath her skin, "the mechanical systems shut down, but the original biological connections are gone. These people are feeling emotions through nervous systems that were never designed to handle them. Then we fix it," Mackenzie said with sudden determination. "We engineer a solution." The 3 townspeople stared at her as if she had suggested flying to the moon. "Fix it how?" the younger man demanded. "You can't just wire new neural pathways. You can't undo 7 decades of surgical modification. You can't resurrect the dead." "No," Mackenzie agreed, "but I can build a bridge." She was already moving toward the master heart, studying its construction with renewed focus. The mechanism wasn't just controlling people. It was mediating their emotional responses, filtering out extremes, providing artificial stability. What if we could restart it, but with different parameters? Instead of suppression, we program it for gradual reintegration. Emotional training wheels. "You want to put them back in the machine?" Margaret asked, horrified. "Temporarily. Long enough for their brains to remember how to process normal human emotions without being overwhelmed. We dial down the intensity, increase it gradually over time, until they can function without mechanical assistance." It was a desperate plan, but as another crash echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like someone screaming about burning the house down, Mackenzie realized it might be their only option. The power requirements alone would be massive, one of the men objected. "The human generators are offline. The people are in no condition to provide energy to the system." "Then we find another power source," Mackenzie said, already examining the generator connections. "This is New Hampshire. There are rivers, wind patterns, geothermal possibilities. We convert the system from human power to renewable energy." "Even if that were possible," the woman said, "you're talking about reprogramming a mechanism that took your grandfather decades to perfect. The complexity—" "I'm a software engineer," Mackenzie interrupted. "Complexity is what I do, and I have something my grandfather didn't have, the ability to learn from his mistakes." She turned to face the group, her mind already racing through the possibilities. "He designed a system based on the elimination of human variability, but variability isn't a bug, it's a feature. Emotions, even negative ones, serve important functions. Grief helps us process loss. Fear keeps us safe. Anger motivates us to fight injustice. Instead of removing these responses, we need to help people manage them." "You're talking about rebuilding the entire system from scratch," Margaret said slowly. "The programming alone would take months, maybe years. Then we buy ourselves time," Mackenzie replied. She was moving around the laboratory now, gathering tools and technical manuals. "We get the basic life support functions back online, just enough to keep people stable while we work on the larger solution. Emergency medical mode instead of full synchronization." Another voice called down from upstairs. "Fire in the Eastern District. Someone's torching the clock tower." The woman who had been arguing with Mackenzie suddenly straightened. "That's the children's school. If the fire spreads..." She looked around the group with dawning urgency. "We have to try something. Even if it's risky. Even if it might not work. We can't just let the town destroy itself." "Tell me about the power grid," Mackenzie said. "All business now. What do we have to work with?" For the next 20 minutes, the basement became a hive of urgent technical discussion. The 3 townspeople, who turned out to be the closest thing Gearbrook Falls had to a governing council, provided detailed information about the town's infrastructure while Margaret shared her knowledge of the mechanism's inner workings. Mackenzie absorbed it all, her engineering background allowing her to process the complex relationships between mechanical, biological, and electrical systems. The Master Heart could be restarted, but it would require significant modifications to operate without human power sources. More challenging was the question of reprogramming. The system's current code was hardwired into mechanical components that couldn't simply be updated like software. "We need a patch," Mackenzie announced finally. "Something that can override the existing programming without requiring complete hardware replacement." "A mechanical patch?" Margaret asked. "A hybrid system. We keep the essential functions, life support, basic emotional regulation, but add digital controllers that can be programmed and reprogrammed as needed. Think of it as adding a smartphone interface to a grandfather clock. It was ambitious to the point of being impossible, but as the sounds of chaos continued to filter down from above, now including what sounded like a full-scale riot, Mackenzie realized that impossible was exactly what the situation demanded. "How long?" the younger man asked. 6 hours to get basic life support back online, Mackenzie estimated. 2 weeks for a functional emotional regulation system. 6 months for a complete solution that allows for full deintegration. And if people can't wait 6 months? Mackenzie looked up from the blueprints she was studying, meeting his eyes directly. Then we help them die with their humanity intact instead of living as machines. Because that's what it means to be human. The right to choose your own fate, even when all the options are terrible. The basement fell silent, except for the distant sounds of a town tearing itself apart. Then Margaret spoke. Her voice steadied despite the tears still streaming down her face. "Tell us what you need." Outside, Gearbrook Falls burned with the fires of liberation. But in the basement laboratory of Gear's house, 4 people began the impossible task of rebuilding paradise. Not as a prison this time, but as a choice. The Master Heart remained silent, but Mackenzie could already envision its resurrection. Not as the cold, perfect mechanism her grandfather had created, but as something warmer, more flexible, more fundamentally human. A machine designed not to eliminate human nature, but to celebrate it. But first, they had to survive the night. And as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the stairs, angry voices calling for justice, for revenge, for someone to blame for 70 years of stolen life, Mackenzie realized that her greatest engineering challenge wasn't going to be rebuilding the machine. It was going to be convincing the people of Gearbrook Falls to trust any machine ever again. The angry voices reached the basement door, just as Mackenzie finished her preliminary calculations for the hybrid system. She could hear at least a dozen people on the stairs, their footsteps irregular and chaotic, so different from the synchronized precision that had characterized the town just hours before. These were the sounds of human beings operating on pure emotion, and that emotion was rage. "Where is she?" someone shouted. "Where's the woman who destroyed everything? Bring her up here to see what she's done," another voice added. "Let her look at the bodies." Margaret gripped Mackenzie's arm with surprising strength. "The storage room," she whispered urgently. "Behind the Master Heart. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft. You can get out through there." But Mackenzie shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the technical drawings spread across the workbench. "I'm not running. These people deserve answers, and more importantly, they deserve a choice about what happens next." The crowd burst into the laboratory like a wave of human fury. Mackenzie counted 15 people, ranging from elderly citizens who had lived through the entire mechanical era to middle-aged individuals who had been children when the integration began. All of them bore the visible marks of their transformation, brass keys hanging from their necks, metallic devices visible beneath their skin, and the hollow-eyed look of people whose entire concept of reality had been shattered. Leading them was a man Mackenzie recognized from the community hall dinner, the silver-haired figure who had tried to convince her to accept the master key. But now his authoritative composure was gone, replaced by the raw confusion of someone discovering that his entire adult life had been a performance. "Dr. Cornelius Ashworth," Margaret said quietly, confirming Mackenzie's suspicion. "The town's former leader, Cordelia's husband. 47 years, Dr. Ashworth said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. 47 years I believed I was making decisions, leading this community, serving the greater good. But I was just another component, wasn't I? Another gear in your grandfather's machine." He stepped closer to Mackenzie, and she could see the desperation in his eyes. "Do you know what I've remembered? I was a doctor, a real doctor, who took an oath to do no harm. And I personally supervised the integration of children, hundreds of children. I watched them lose their capacity for wonder, for spontaneous joy, for the beautiful chaos of young minds learning about the world. And I felt nothing. Nothing. But you remember feeling nothing," Mackenzie said quietly, "which means you're capable of feeling something now, including regret." "Regret?" A woman near the back of the crowd laughed bitterly. "Regret doesn't resurrect the dead. Regret doesn't give us back 70 years of stolen life. Regret doesn't explain to my daughter why her mother became a stranger, who spoke in schedules and efficiency reports instead of love. The crowd murmured angry agreement, and Mackenzie could feel the situation escalating toward violence. These people needed someone to blame, someone to punish for their suffering, and she was the most convenient target. "You're right," she said, raising her voice to address the entire group. "Regret isn't enough, but it's a start, because the capacity to feel regret means you're human again. You're capable of moral judgment, of empathy, of choosing to be better than you were before." "Easy words from someone who didn't lose everything," Dr. Ashworth snapped. "I lost my husband 6 months ago," Mackenzie replied evenly. "Sudden industrial accident. One moment he was texting me about dinner plans, the next moment he was gone. And you know what? The grief nearly killed me. I spent weeks unable to function, unable to eat, unable to see any point in continuing. Part of me envied your mechanical certainty, your freedom from overwhelming emotion." The crowd had grown quieter, listening despite their anger. But that grief, horrible as it was also love. It was proof that what David and I had together mattered, that his life had meaning, that losing him was genuinely devastating because gaining him had been genuinely wonderful. "Your grandfather's machine would have taken that away from me. It would have turned the loss of the most important person in my life into a minor data point to be processed and filed away." She gestured toward the silent Master Heart. "I stopped the mechanism because some things are worth suffering for. Love is worth grief. Freedom is worth uncertainty. Humanity is worth pain." "Beautiful philosophy," said a younger woman who had been silent until now. "But philosophy doesn't solve the practical problem. Half the town is in psychological crisis. 3 people are dead, and more are talking about suicide. The infrastructure is failing because the people who maintained it are too traumatized to work. We're facing complete societal collapse. Which is why I'm proposing a solution," Mackenzie said. She moved to the workbench and spread out the technical drawings she had been working on. "Not a return to the old system, but something new. Something that preserves your freedom while providing support for the transition." Dr. Ashworth studied the blueprints with professional interest. "A graduated deintegration protocol?" "Exactly. We restart the Master Heart, but with completely different programming. Instead of suppressing emotions, it helps manage them. Instead of eliminating choice, it provides guidance. Think of it as therapy delivered through technology. Artificial support while your natural coping mechanisms remember how to function." "You want to put us back in the machine?" someone accused. "I want to give you the option of temporary assistance," Mackenzie corrected. "Completely voluntary, completely reversible, with full transparency about what the system is doing and why. No hidden programming, no permanent modifications, no loss of autonomy." She pointed to specific elements of her design. The system would monitor stress levels and provide calming inputs when anxiety becomes overwhelming. It would offer memory assistance to help you process recovered experiences gradually, instead of all at once. It would provide gentle suggestions for coping strategies, not commands. "And if we choose not to participate?" Dr. Ashworth asked. "Then you don't participate. The system would still provide basic infrastructure support, power, water, emergency services, but individual psychological assistance would be strictly opt-in." Margaret stepped forward, her voice still shaky but growing stronger. "It could work. The basic framework exists. We would just need to completely rewrite the control algorithms and add manual override systems." "How long?" the younger woman asked. 6 hours for basic infrastructure restoration," Mackenzie replied. 24 hours for a functional voluntary assistance system. 1 week for full implementation with all safety protocols. "And the power source?" Mackenzie had been dreading this question. That's the challenging part. The system was designed to run on human bioelectric energy, but obviously that's not an option anymore. We would need to convert to external power generation. Solar, wind, water, whatever resources the town has available. "The waterfall," Dr. Ashworth said suddenly. "Gearbrook Falls itself. Your grandfather chose this location partly because of the hydroelectric potential, but he decided human power was more reliable. There's already a generator system in place. It's just been dormant for decades." "That could work," Mackenzie agreed, feeling a spark of hope. "Hydroelectric is stable, renewable, and doesn't require human sacrifice." The crowd was beginning to murmur among themselves, and Mackenzie could sense the mood shifting from pure anger toward cautious consideration. They were still hurt, still traumatized, but they were also practical people who understood that their choices were limited. "There's something else," said an elderly man who had been silent until now. The children. The laboratory fell quiet. Everyone knew what he meant. The current population of Gearbrook Falls included people who had been integrated as children, who had spent their entire conscious lives as components of the machine. They had no adult memories of natural emotion, no learned coping strategies, no experience with genuine human choice. "How old were you?" Mackenzie asked the man gently. 8, he replied. "I'm 78 now. I remember fragments from before. My mother's voice, the taste of birthday cake, the feeling of running just for the joy of movement. But I don't remember how to be sad without being consumed by sadness. I don't remember how to be angry without wanting to destroy everything. I don't remember how to love without losing myself completely." "Which is exactly why the graduated system could help," Mackenzie said. "You wouldn't have to figure it out alone. The technology would provide scaffolding while you develop natural emotional regulation. Or it could be another trap," someone said. "Another way to control us." "Then make it transparent," Mackenzie challenged. "Open source code, public oversight, democratic control. Build in safeguards that prevent any single person or group from taking control of the system. Make it truly accountable to the people it serves." Dr. Ashworth was studying the technical specifications with growing interest. The individual override systems, they would allow each person to adjust their own parameters? Within safe limits? Yes. Think of it like medication dosing. The system provides recommendations, but you control the actual implementation. You could dial up emotional support during difficult periods and dial it down as you develop confidence in your natural responses. And the exit protocol? Complete disconnection whenever requested, with no penalties and no permanent effects. The goal is to help people transition back to full humanity, not to create a new form of dependence. The crowd was beginning to divide into factions, some still skeptical, others cautiously interested, a few openly hopeful. But before the discussion could continue, a new voice called down from the stairs. "Fire's spreading to the residential district. We need help with evacuations." The immediate crisis snapped everyone back to reality. Whatever they decided about Mackenzie's proposal, people were in danger right now. "How many do we have working on fire suppression?" Dr. Ashworth asked. "Maybe 20, and they're mostly just moving valuables. Nobody knows how to organize a proper firefighting effort without the coordination protocols." Margaret stood up straighter, and for a moment, Mackenzie could see the woman she had been before 70 years of mechanical existence. "I do. I was a volunteer firefighter before the integration. The muscle memory is still there. The water pressure system is down," someone reported. The pumps were tied into the master heart. "Emergency power," Mackenzie said immediately. "We can get basic infrastructure back online in 30 minutes if we bypass the human bioelectric systems and connect directly to the hydroelectric generator." Dr. Ashworth looked around the room, taking in the faces of his former citizens. "Emergency vote. All in favor of temporary emergency restoration to save the town?" Every hand went up. "And after the emergency, do we consider the voluntary assistance system?" This time the vote was closer, but still passed by a clear majority. "Then let's get to work," Dr. Ashworth said. "But I want full transparency from this point forward. No hidden protocols, no secret programming, no paternalistic decisions about what's best for us. We're human beings, not problems to be solved." As the crowd dispersed to begin emergency repairs, Mackenzie found herself alone with Margaret and the silent master heart. The older woman was staring at the massive mechanical organ with an expression of profound sadness. "Regrets?" Mackenzie asked. "Many," Margaret replied, "but also hope. For the first time in 70 years, I feel hope for the future instead of just satisfaction with the present. That has to be worth something." Outside, Gearbrook Falls continued to burn with the fires of liberation. But in the basement laboratory, 2 women began the delicate work of rebuilding paradise. Not as perfection this time, but as possibility. The master heart would beat again. But this time, it would beat in service of human choice, rather than mechanical certainty. This time, it would beat with hope. Dawn broke over Gearbrook Falls like a surgeon's light illuminating a complex operation. From the basement laboratory of Gear's house, Mackenzie could hear the sounds of a town learning to breathe again, the chaotic symphony of human voices raised in genuine emotion rather than mechanical harmony. Some were crying, others laughing with desperate relief, and a few were still screaming as their minds struggled to process 70 years of suppressed memories. But beneath it all was a new sound, the steady rhythm of hammers on metal, saws cutting wood, and voices calling out coordinated instructions. The people of Gearbrook Falls were building something. Hydroelectric connection is stable, Dr. Ashworth reported, climbing down into the laboratory with grease-stained hands and something that might have been a genuine smile. The old generator system is more robust than we expected. Your grandfather might have been a monster, but he was an excellent engineer. Mackenzie looked up from the Master Heart, where she had spent the last 6 hours rewiring core systems with Margaret's assistance. The massive mechanical organ now bristled with additional components, digital interfaces, override switches, and monitoring systems that would make every process transparent and reversible. Power levels? 80% of previous capacity, and climbing as we bring more turbines online. More than enough to run the voluntary assistance protocols. Margaret emerged from behind the Master Heart, her face smudged with oil, but her eyes bright with purpose. The neural interface arrays are ready for testing. We've isolated each subsystem so that individuals can control their own level of integration. No central override, no hidden commands, no way for the system to act without explicit user consent, and the emergency shutoff. Multiple redundancies, Dr. Ashworth confirmed. Any individual can disconnect themselves instantly. Any group of 10 or more citizens can shut down the entire system. And if the Democratic Oversight Committee detects any unauthorized activity, the whole network goes offline automatically. It had been the most intense 18 hours of Mackenzie's career, working alongside people whose technical knowledge had been suppressed for decades. She had essentially rebuilt her grandfather's masterpiece from the ground up. But instead of a mechanism designed to control, they had created something unprecedented, a voluntary technological symbiosis that enhanced human capability without replacing human choice. The first volunteers are ready, someone called down from upstairs. Mrs. Chen specifically requested to be in the initial test group. Mackenzie felt her stomach tighten. Mrs. Chen was the woman who had tried to remove her cardiac regulator with a kitchen knife during the first hours of liberation. If anyone needed technological assistance to manage overwhelming emotions, it was her. But she was also the riskiest test case, someone whose psychological state was already fragile. "Are we sure she's making this decision rationally?" Mackenzie asked. "She's been meeting with our volunteer counselors for the past 12 hours, Dr. Ashworth replied. Former psychiatrists and social workers whose training is coming back to them. Mrs. Chen understands the risks, but she also understands that without some form of support, she's not going to survive the psychological trauma of full reintegration. Margaret was running final diagnostics on the Master Heart's new systems. All indicators are green. The voluntary assistance protocols are ready for implementation. Then, let's see if we can do better than my grandfather, Mackenzie said, her hand hovering over the activation switch. The Master Heart came to life with a sound completely different from its previous incarnation. Instead of the cold, precise tick-tock that had dominated the town for 7 decades, it began to beat with something warmer, more organic, a rhythm that suggested life rather than machinery. Mrs. Chen was the first to descend into the laboratory, accompanied by 2 volunteer counselors and Dr. Ashworth. She was a small woman in her 70s, but Mackenzie could see the strength in her posture, the determination in her eyes. This was someone who had made a conscious choice to trust technology again, despite everything it had taken from her. "How does this work?" Mrs. Chen asked, studying the interface panels that Mackenzie had designed to be as user-friendly as possible. "Think of it as a conversation between you and the system," Mackenzie explained, leading her to one of the individual interface stations. "The technology can monitor your stress levels, your emotional state, your neurological activity, but it can only respond to what you explicitly allow it to address." She gestured to a control panel that looked more like a smartphone than the mechanical interfaces of the old system. "You can request assistance with anxiety management, memory processing, emotional regulation, whatever you need, but you control the intensity, the duration, and the specific type of support. The system makes suggestions, but you make all the decisions." Mrs. Chen placed her hand on the biometric scanner, and immediately the interface came alive with displays showing her current psychological state. Mackenzie could see elevated stress hormones, irregular neural activity patterns, and the telltale signs of someone whose mind was operating far outside normal parameters. "It looks pretty chaotic in there," Mrs. Chen said with a weak smile, studying her own readouts. "Chaos isn't always bad," Margaret replied softly. "Sometimes chaos is just another word for freedom." But right now, I could use a little less freedom and a little more stability, Mrs. Chen admitted. Just enough to function while I figure out how to be human again. She began adjusting the interface controls, requesting mild anxiety reduction and memory processing assistance. The Master Heart responded immediately, but instead of the invasive override of the old system, Mackenzie could see that it was providing gentle suggestions, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, and gradual exposure to recovered memories rather than overwhelming floods of suppressed experience. "How do you feel?" Dr. Ashworth asked. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, her eyes closed as she experienced the system's assistance. "Like I'm learning to walk again," she said finally. "The emotions are still there, but they're not drowning me. I can actually think through them instead of just being consumed by them." Over the next 4 hours, 12 more volunteers joined the test program. Each person worked with the interface differently, requesting different types of support, adjusting parameters based on their individual needs. Some needed help processing grief over lost time. Others required assistance managing rage at what had been done to them. A few simply wanted support as they rediscovered positive emotions that had been suppressed for decades. But the most remarkable participant was Tommy Holloway, the serious 5-year-old who was now 78 years old and experiencing adult emotions for the first time in his conscious memory. "I remember asking my mother why the sky was blue," he told Mackenzie as he worked with the interface. "But I don't remember how it felt to be curious. I don't remember what it was like to wonder about things just for the joy of discovery." The system was helping him access those buried emotional patterns, providing scaffolding as his mind slowly remembered how to experience wonder, how to ask questions not for efficiency, but for the simple pleasure of learning. "It's like being a child and an old man at the same time," he said with amazement. "I have all this life experience, but I'm feeling it with fresh eyes. Everything is new again." By noon, word of the successful test had spread throughout Gearbrook Falls. People began arriving at Gear's house in small groups, some curious, others desperate, a few still skeptical but willing to consider the possibility of technological assistance that didn't require surrendering their humanity. But not everyone was convinced. "You're asking us to trust the same type of system that enslaved us for 70 years, argued James Morrison, whose twin brother had been one of the suicide victims from the first night. "What happens when someone decides to reprogram it for their own purposes? What happens when the democratic oversight fails? What happens when you're not here to maintain it?" These were the right questions, Mackenzie realized. The essential questions that her grandfather had never bothered to ask, because he had never believed that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves. "Then you shut it down," she said simply. "The system is designed to be temporary, remember? The goal is to help people develop natural coping strategies so that technological assistance becomes unnecessary. And if at any point the community decides the risks outweigh the benefits, you pull the plug and go back to managing without mechanical help." "But what about the people who become dependent on it?" James pressed. "What about those who choose to stay connected indefinitely?" "Then that's their choice," Dr. Ashworth interjected. "As long as they're making informed decisions about their own lives, who are we to say they're wrong? The crime wasn't that people became dependent on technology. It was that they weren't allowed to choose their level of dependence." The debate continued throughout the afternoon, but Mackenzie could see that the community was gradually reaching consensus. Not unanimous agreement, that would have been another form of mechanical uniformity, but the messy, complicated democratic process of humans figuring out how to live together. As evening approached, she found herself alone with the Master Heart, making final adjustments to the systems that would allow Gearbrook Falls to chart its own course. The massive mechanical organ beat steadily, but its rhythm was no longer imposed from above. It was emerging from the collective choices of the people it served, sometimes irregular, sometimes uncertain, but always authentically human. "Thank you." Mackenzie turned to find Mrs. Chen standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking remarkably peaceful for someone who had been in psychological crisis just 24 hours earlier. "For what?" "For showing us that we could trust ourselves with technology, instead of letting technology replace ourselves. For the first time since I was a child, I feel like I have agency in my own life." Others were gathering behind her. Volunteers from the test program, members of the Democratic Oversight Committee, citizens who had chosen to remain unconnected but supported the system for those who needed it. Not everyone in Gearbrook Falls had come to the laboratory, but enough had come to represent the community's decision. "So what happens now?" Margaret asked. "Now we live," Dr. Ashworth said. "Messily, imperfectly, authentically. Some of us with technological assistance, others without. Some days will be harder than others. We'll make mistakes, argue about decisions, probably change our minds multiple times about how much help we want from the system. And that's okay? That's human," Tommy Holloway replied with the wonder of someone experiencing choice for the first time in 70 years. As the crowd dispersed, returning to their homes and their newly complicated lives, Mackenzie prepared to leave Gearbrook Falls. Her work here was done, not because she had solved every problem, but because she had given the community the tools to solve their own problems. But Margaret stopped her at the laboratory door. "Where will you go?" Mackenzie considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have returned to her empty apartment in Boston, to her job debugging other people's systems, to the hollow routine of life without David. But that woman felt like a stranger now. "I think I'll stay in New Hampshire," she said. "Maybe start my own consulting firm. There must be other communities struggling with the balance between technology and humanity. Other places where people need help building systems that serve them instead of controlling them. And if Gearbrook Falls needs you again?" Mackenzie smiled, listening to the warm, irregular heartbeat of the master heart. No longer a mechanism of control, but an instrument of choice. "Then you call. But I suspect you'll figure out most problems on your own. That's what humans do. We adapt, we innovate, we find ways to muddle through even when we don't have all the answers." She climbed the stairs out of the laboratory, leaving behind the basement where her grandfather had tried to perfect humanity, and where she had instead learned to embrace its imperfections. The house felt different now, still breathing, but with the rhythm of life rather than machinery. Outside, Gearbrook Falls was settling into its first night of voluntary existence in 7 decades. Some houses showed the warm glow of artificial assistance from the Master Hearts network. Others remained dark, their occupants choosing to face their emotions without technological mediation. Both choices were valid. Both were human. As Mackenzie drove away from the town, she could still hear the Master Heart beating in the distance. Not the cold precision of her grandfather's mechanism, but something warmer, more complex, more alive. It was the sound of a community learning to trust itself with the tools of its own destiny. Behind her, Gearbrook Falls breathed with the rhythm of choice, imperfect and beautiful and utterly, wonderfully human. The Clockwork Covenant had become something her grandfather never could have imagined. Not a contract between people and machines, but a collaboration. Not perfection, but possibility. And in the end, that was enough. The mechanism lived, but humanity had won.